Blanche pulled the thick cream guest list from beneath. The Duke's fingers drew a hard pencil line through 3 entries and did not look up. When he caught the far edge, their hands met over the paper. Blanche held on. If your Grace invites all 3 on the same evening, you do not need a hostess. You need a fire engine waiting in the drive. The Duke of Bramblewood did not ring for a footman. He leaned closer. Candlelight caught his black evening coat and the silver tea service between them. The tall clock behind him was nearing midnight. Blanche's pale muslin gown was plainly remade. Through the open card-room doors, the widow who had recommended her remained within sight, preserving the propriety of this one-evening paid trial. Blanche needed the fee, the reference, and work far from her stepmother's house. If tonight failed, she would return to being useful only when no one had to name her usefulness as work. "And why?" he asked, a quick smile sharpening with interest. "Would my guests require a fire engine, Miss Kelsey? The gentleman you placed second will insult the man opposite before the soup is cleared. The young woman between them refused a match connected with his family last Tuesday. The lady beside her will begin proposing another before dessert." Blanche tapped the 3 marks. "You have drawn 3 quarrels into 6 chairs. The smile left his face. His gaze moved across the list again. "You did not learn that from a newspaper." "No. I learned it by watching who would not look at whom after Sunday service." Blanche gathered her pencil and memorandum book. "I can make this room function for you, Your Grace. That does not mean I belong to it." The first stroke of midnight sounded. The Duke did not call for her carriage. He pushed the whole guest list across the cold tea tray. "What terms?" Blanche's fingers stopped. "For what?" "To stay. Women in your position are more often hired as companions, I know. I do not need another lady to pour tea and agree with me. I need the judgment you have just used on that list. What wages will keep you at Bramblewood as my social secretary until the end of the season?" He had asked what terms she required, not what gratitude ought to purchase. Blanche answered before courage could become caution. "Weekly wages paid directly to me. A room of my own. 1 full day each week. The right to veto 3 invitations, and Mrs. Locksley remains the first few days, so no one may call the arrangement secret." He laughed unguarded. "A mercenary. A woman asking you to pay for judgment." "Agreed. 1 term from me if you save me from a boring guest. I may demand a private joke, not a favor. Only the joke." Blanche nodded. "I accept." By the middle of their first week, the long oak table in the drawing room had become a campaign table. Blanche spread calling cards, draft invitations, and seating plans across it in ordered ranks, then shifted them whenever a new visit revealed an old grievance. Rupert, she had learned his Christian name only because Mrs. Locksley used it when speaking of him, stood at the window for so long that Blanche finally glanced up. "I thought a secretary sorted correspondence," he said. "You appear to be planning an invasion. You are putting Lady Eastlake far too close to the conservatory doors." Rupert added, lifting his brandy. "She complains of drafts. She complains of drafts when she wishes to escape a conversation." Blanche shifted the card 2 inches. "Lord Hastings will be near the fireplace. If they come within 10 feet of one another, she will demand an apology for the insult of 1812. The conservatory gives her an honorable retreat before she can begin." Rupert paused with the glass halfway to his mouth. "You are deliberately driving my guests away." "I am deciding when they may leave with dignity." Blanche met his eyes. "Structure saves you from having to be charming every minute, Your Grace. You cannot smile away a 10-year feud." "I have done it before." His tone made the boast half a challenge and half an invitation to disprove him. "Then you exhausted yourself for no reason," Blanche said. He set the glass aside. "Watch me." That afternoon, a neighboring squire, Mr. Thorne, a stiff man with a habit of extending a call until tea threatened to become supper, arrived without warning. Blanche withdrew to the corner desk with a letter before her and watched over the top of the page. Rupert never went near the formal chairs. He met Mr. Thorne at the door, guided him toward a painting of a bay hunter, and turned a compliment about the squire's stables into grave concern over how urgently such an estate must need its master. By the 12th minute, Mr. Thorne was laughing, agreeing that duty called, and walking himself out as though leaving early had been his own decision. The door clicked shut. Rupert turned and raised one eyebrow at Blanche. She tapped her pen against her chin. Flattery would have been easy. Accuracy was better. That was not structure, she admitted. That was theft. You stole his afternoon and made him thank you for it. It is called charm, Miss Kelsey. It is a weapon. She corrected, and to her annoyance a real smile escaped. A useful one. I will arrange the board. You move the pieces. So that became their bargain in practice. Blanche governed the geography of the room. Rupert governed its motion. Neither skill made the other unnecessary, which was perhaps why working beside him began to feel less like service and more like a contest she was pleased not to win alone. As May deepened, Bramblewood house filled. Carriages rolled in from neighbouring Kent estates. The quiet corridors took on the rustle of silk, the click of card counters, the scrape of music stands in the small ballroom, and the constant rise and fall of voices at the drawing-room doors. Blanche learned when to be visible and when to disappear into usefulness. A chair moved before a quarrel began. A footman received a new instruction before a guest noticed delay. A shy daughter found herself beside the one woman who could introduce her without making the favor look arranged. Blanche's work was to see where people wanted to stand and what it cost them to move. Yet the part of the work she began to measure most carefully came after the house emptied. One afternoon they rehearsed the opening country dance because Rupert insisted the musicians had set too lively a pace. He took a turn early. Blanche stopped and informed him that even a duke could not revise a figure by smiling at it. He called this a constitutional defect in English dancing. His laugh followed her through the rest of the day. A few nights later, after a demanding supper, it was past 1 before the last carriage left. One branch of candles remained lit in the small dining parlour. Blanche sat with a plate of cold pheasant and the first hunger she had allowed herself to notice since mid-afternoon. Rupert entered without his formal coat. His cravat loosened, looking less like the host of 60 people than the man behind the host. He did not ring for a servant. He poured water for himself, glanced at her nearly empty glass, and filled that too before taking the chair opposite. The gesture was so ordinary that Blanche almost missed it. Lord Halliday, Rupert said, rubbing one hand over his hair, was 40 minutes late. Again. I am aware. It ruined the soup. Blanche cut a piece of pheasant. I had plans for that soup. He believes his rank permits him to alter time, Rupert said, stealing a piece of bread from the edge of her plate. Blanche let him keep it. He believes it because everyone waits for him. Tomorrow's card evening begins at 9. I have invited him for 8. The evening begins at 9. Precisely. He will arrive at 20 minutes to 10, convinced he is fashionably late, and discover that every decent table has been occupied for 40 minutes. The only chair left will be beside the service door, where he can listen to the footman discuss plates. Rupert stared at her, then smiled slowly. It was not the quick social smile he gave a room before he took possession of it. Blanche had begun to know the difference. This one arrived late and stayed. You are ruthless. I am practical, she replied, and failed to hide her answering smile. The next evening, Halliday arrived at 20 minutes to 10 and spent 2 hours in the least desirable chair in the card room, bewildered by a punishment no one acknowledged as punishment. Across the room, Rupert lifted his glass toward Blanche. She lifted one brow in return. It was their joke, and because no one else knew it existed, it felt unexpectedly precious. Those 10-minute intervals after the last guest became a private country inside the season. They argued over menus. He read pompous lines from invitations and waited for her verdict. Once he asked whether she preferred tea or chocolate after a late dance, remembered the answer the next week, and said nothing about remembering it. Blanche liked the speed of his mind, the way he eased embarrassment without making people feel managed, and the rarer quiet after the performance ended. More dangerously, she noticed his gaze finding her across crowded rooms before he had any question to ask. The first time her weekly day of freedom coincided with a troublesome call. Blanche returned from a long walk expecting to find a message summoning her. There was none. Rupert had seated two incompatible visitors at opposite ends of the morning room and endured the consequences himself. "It was dreadful," he told her that evening. "You would have fixed it in 3 minutes." Blanche waited. He added, "But the day was yours." She found that sentence harder to dismiss than a compliment. Then, in the 4th week, Lavinia Lockwood arrived. Blanche's stepmother swept into an afternoon gathering with the sweet carrying voice she used when she wanted cruelty to sound like concern. Lavinia had spent years calling Blanche too old, too plain, too exacting, while relying on her to settle invitations, mend quarrels, and remember who must never be seated beside whom. Seeing the same skill paid for beneath a duke's roof did not soften her. From the edge of the terrace, Blanche saw Lavinia corner Lady Eastlake behind a painted fan. She knew the angle of that fan. It meant a confidence meant to travel. Rupert stood near the French doors. His gaze followed Lavinia, then returned once to Blanche. He did not cross the terrace to ask what she had seen. Instead, he smiled. Blanche knew that smile now. It was the one he used when he meant to make a difficult person feel singularly important. Rupert crossed the terrace, bowed to Lavinia, laughed at an observation about the weather that did not deserve rescue, and offered his arm for a turn through the rose walk. Within minutes, Lavinia was leaning toward him, pleased with herself. Blanche went still. She watched the man who ate cold pheasant across from her after midnight give Lavinia the same concentrated warmth that had sometimes seemed private. Her mind supplied the likely explanation before her pride could object. It was a tactic. He was trying to learn what Lavinia had been saying. Knowing that should have helped. It did not. The sharper wound was not that Rupert could charm another woman. Blanche had always known he could. It was that he had made a move in the field they shared and decided she did not need to know the plan. If attention could be deployed like a card, what did his attention mean when the room was empty? She did not flee the terrace or allow Lavinia the satisfaction of seeing distress. She tightened her fingers around the leather cover of her memorandum book until its edge pressed into her palm. If Rupert meant to play the room without telling her, Blanche would show him what an undisclosed move felt like. An hour later, as the party moved toward supper, Rupert returned with Lavinia on his arm, and a look of easy satisfaction Blanche liked even less. He guided her toward a place of honor near the head of the table. Her place card was no longer there. Blanche had moved it to the far end of the table between a rector who heard poorly and a gentleman whose consuming interest was the cultivation of turnips. Lavinia's face colored. Rupert looked down the length of the table, then across the room to Blanche. She stood beside the doors with the expression she reserved for changes that had been entirely intentional and were none of anyone's business. Supper passed under a strained truce. When the last carriage finally departed, Blanche went to the drawing room and began stacking place cards into their proper boxes. Rupert arrived before she had finished the first row. "You moved her," he said. No smile, no lightness. "I corrected the seating." Blanche kept her eyes on the cards. She was badly placed for conversation. She was exactly where I placed her. He stopped on the opposite side of the table. "She had told Lady Eastlake that your wages were merely an excuse for keeping you here. I was learning who else had heard it." Blanche looked up. Anger came first because it was easier to manage than hurt. "You were flirting with the woman who spent 10 years teaching me that usefulness was the only place I was allowed to occupy, and you did it without telling me why." "It was a tactic, Blanche. It meant nothing." "That is precisely the difficulty." her voice lowered. If your charm means nothing whenever it is convenient, I cannot know when to trust it. And if you make social moves that touch my work without telling me, you make me answer for a board I have not been allowed to see. The reply stopped him, his shoulders drawn tight when he entered, eased by a degree. This is the work you hired me to do, Blanche continued. I manage invitations, alliances, and reputations. You may disagree with me. You may overrule me as host if you choose, but you may not secretly alter the ground beneath the plan and expect me to smile because your intention was good. Rupert's gaze dropped to the place cards in her hands. When he looked back at her, the quick answer she expected did not come. He set both hands flat on the table, then deliberately took one step back. I used the room instead of talking to you, he said. There was no wit in the sentence. I believed the result would excuse the method. It did not. I should have told you what I meant to learn before I went near her. From now on, if a tactic crosses into your work, you hear it before the room does. He glanced at the guest list beside her hand. And if you tell me not to use it, I will not. Blanche watched him for the small smile that would turn the apology into another performance. It never came. She looked at Lavinia's displaced card. Then I owe you the same truth. I moved her because I was jealous. The word cost more than expected. And because I was angry that you possessed information I did not. I told myself I was protecting supper. I was also protecting my advantage. I do not like discovering I cannot calculate every part of a room. A breath of amusement touched his face, but he did not use it to escape the subject. I am relieved to learn I can still surprise you. Do not become vain. I said I dislike it. Jealous and irritated, he said. One more word and tomorrow you sit beside the turnip gentleman. This time his laugh was quiet. Then he picked up the remaining place cards, carried them around the table, and set them down on Blanche's side, rather than rearranging a single one. Tomorrow's room is yours, he said. It was a small act, but it made the apology visible. Blanche slid him half the stack. Ours, she corrected, provided you disclose your crimes before committing them. 3 nights later, Bramblewood held a smaller dance. The orchestra played a bright country set in the little ballroom, while Blanche stood near a pillar watching the lines form and dissolve, exactly as she had planned. Rupert was across the floor speaking with a magistrate. Blanche looked at the dancers, then at him. The sensible course was to remain where she was. Yet she had spent years using every social instinct to avoid giving anyone a weapon. The habit kept her safe. It also kept her at the edge of every room. She finished the last adjustment to the set, handed her memorandum book to a footman, and crossed the polished floor before she could convert desire into strategy. Rupert saw her coming and excused himself from the magistrate. 3 matrons nearby quieted. Blanche saw them notice. She went on anyway. Your Grace, she said, the room requires nothing from me for the next dance. I would like one anyway. She held his gaze. With you. There, no usefulness to hide behind. No emergency, no bargain. For one heartbeat, Rupert looked almost startled. Then he bowed perfectly and without a joke. The honor is mine, Miss Kelsey. He offered his hand. She placed hers in it. They entered the set. The first figure carried them apart, the second returned them, and each meeting felt deliberate, because neither could pretend it served the house. His gloved hand met hers. Warm awareness ran up her arm, impossible to file under work. When the figure gave her the route, he followed. When the turn quickened, she accepted the steadiness of his hand. He murmured, You are smiling. Blanche answered, Do not make me regret it. His grin widened, but he obeyed. At the edge of the ballroom, Lavinia watched. Blanche saw the fan in her hand stop moving. That night, long after her candle had been snuffed, Blanche lay awake, replaying the moment she had crossed the floor without a practical reason. Wanting the dance had been simple. Allowing the room to see that she wanted it was not. For the first time since coming to Bramblewood, She wondered whether leaving at season's end might hurt for reasons no wage or reference could settle, and whether admitting that fear would cost her more than silence. The rumor began the following afternoon. It traveled through morning calls with the efficiency of something people wanted to believe. Blanche Kelsey had been hired for one evening and contrived never to leave. The title of social secretary, Lavinia suggested, was merely a respectable veil for a woman who meant to catch a duke. By evening, conversations thinned when Blanche entered. One lady who had begged her advice over a seating quarrel 3 days earlier suddenly found the window fascinating. Another spoke to her with exaggerated kindness. The second was worse. Blanche was in the library, resorting a stack of harmless invitations that did not need sorting when Rupert came in. She realized what her hands were doing and stopped. "They are saying you engineered the position to trap me," he said. His voice was hard, but the anger was not aimed at her. "I know. I can answer it before supper." He began to pace once, then checked himself. "A sentence from me would stop half of them." "A romantic sentence?" Blanche asked. "Then Lavinia wins. If you tell the room you admire me, every hour I worked here becomes evidence that I was waiting to be admired back." Rupert's jaw tightened. "I will not stand by while they make sport of you." "Then do not make me your cause." Blanche placed both palms on the desk until she trusted them to be still. "They are not really questioning whether you care for me. They are questioning whether I did work worth paying for. If you rescue my reputation with rank, I lose the very thing that gives the answer weight." A familiar smile almost appeared on Rupert's face, the fast one, the one that could turn a hostile table into an amused one. It stopped before it fully formed. He looked at her instead. "What is your part?" he asked. "And what is mine?" The question steadied her more than reassurance. "I manage the alliances. I decide where the accusation has no room to grow. When the time comes, you are the host. State what work I did, what authority I had, and whether I was paid. Nothing about affection. Nothing about what you may want from me after the season." "Understood." He gave the word no flourish. The closing ball arrived 3 days later. Bramblewood House blazed with candlelight. Nearly every family of consequence in the surrounding county had come curious enough about the season's success to attend, and curious enough about Blanche to watch where she stood. Lavinia had prepared for an argument. Blanche prepared a room. Before supper, she altered only what was necessary. Lavinia was not banished to an obvious corner. Isolation would have made her a martyr. Instead, Blanche placed her among women whose own experience of the season made the rumor expensive to repeat. Lady Eastlake sat on one side of Lavinia, Mrs. Linfield on the other, with the Countess of Mar opposite. Each had at some point during the season asked Blanche to solve a social difficulty without spectacle. None owed her affection. That was precisely why Blanche trusted their judgment. The first course had barely been cleared when Lavinia lifted her voice just enough for the neighboring places to hear. "It is remarkable, Blanche. One paid evening has become an entire season. Some women would call that very good planning indeed." Several heads turned. Blanche set down the place card she had been carrying and met her stepmother's eyes. "If you mean I planned to make myself useful enough to be employed, madam, then yes. That was the object." Her tone stayed courteous. "If you mean marriage, you are discussing a courtship that has not occurred and a paid arrangement you have never read. Which accusation would you prefer us to examine?" Lavinia's smile thinned. "Oh, do not be clever. Everyone can see why the Duke kept you." Lady Eastlake put down her wine-glass with a small, decisive click. "I can see why he kept her. Miss Kelsey prevented my daughter's first supper from becoming a quarrel between 2 branches of the family." She looked directly at Lavinia. "The Duke was not even in the room when I asked for her help." Mrs. Linfield added, "I consulted Miss Kelsey about my own invitations. I saw Mrs. Loxley enter her terms in the house book. To call paid work a courtship merely because a woman performs it well is vulgar." The Countess of Mar then asked Lavinia, almost idly, whether she had ever paid Blanche for the same sort of labor in her own house. That question did what Blanche had hoped the seating would do. Lavinia could not answer without admitting either that Blanche's skill had value or that she had used it for years without naming it as work. Her audience did not turn hostile. It simply ceased to be hers. Lavinia pushed back her chair. "I have lost my appetite." Blanche inclined her head. "Then I shall have the carriage called when you wish it." She did not smile. She did not need to. No one at the table rose with her. Lady Eastlake had already turned to ask Mrs. Linfield about the next course, and not a single fan lifted in farewell. After Lavinia left the supper room, 2 conversations restarted at once. That ordinary sound mattered more than triumph. The rumor had not been defeated by romance. It had failed because the people asked to carry it had facts of their own. At the head of the table, Rupert stood and lifted his glass. The room quieted. Blanche felt the old instinct to prepare for whatever came next. She made herself leave the place cards alone. "Before this season closes," Rupert said, "I wish to acknowledge why Bramblewood has functioned as well as it has. Miss Blanche Kelsey has served this house as a paid social secretary. Her wages have been entered and settled in the ordinary way. Her authority over invitations and seating was given because her judgment deserved it." No flirtation softened the words. No private glance asked Blanche to reward him for saying them. "The success of this season belongs chiefly to her," Rupert continued. "My written reference will say so to any house in England that has sense enough to ask for it." He raised his glass. "To Miss Kelsey." For half a breath, no one moved. The silence stretched across the table, not hostile but measuring, as though the room itself were deciding what truth it would carry beyond Bramblewood. Then Lady Eastlake raised her glass. "To Miss Kelsey." Others followed. The toast spread through the room without becoming a spectacle, and Blanche found she could breathe through it because Rupert had named the work before he named nothing else. Before the company reached the ballroom, one lady from Canterbury asked whether Blanche accepted autumn commissions. A second requested permission to write in September. Blanche answered both herself. The future Lavinia had tried to close had opened in 2 directions. And yet one doubt remained. Rupert had been exact, almost severe, in the distance he placed between her employment and anything personal. He had called her Miss Kelsey his social secretary. He had spoken of the contract as finished. The very correctness she had asked of him left a small, unreasonable ache beneath her ribs. The ball continued. Blanche managed the final departures, watched wraps returned to the right owners, and heard the last carriage roll away over the gravel. When she returned to the drawing room, the clock was still ticking in the same dark panelling where it had counted out her first midnight. The silver tea service had been cleared. The final guest list lay folded on a chair, no longer a weapon, a promise or a problem, merely paper. Rupert stood by the window. He turned when she entered. "It is done," Blanche said. "My wages are settled. Mrs. Loxley has my reference. I have 2 inquiries for autumn work, and my carriage is ordered for tomorrow morning." He came toward her, but stopped well short of the table between them. Blanche could see the weariness in his face now that there was no room left to entertain. "Your contract is finished," he said. "Yes." "And I am no longer your employer." "No." He drew one breath. When he spoke again, it was the plain voice from their quarrel, not the one that could make a tedious man leave delighted. "On your first night I asked you to stay because Bramblewood needed your judgment. I needed you to make the room work." He took one step nearer. "Tonight the room works, and the season is finished. I do not need a secretary. I do not need a hostess." His eyes held hers. "Blanche, may I call upon you after you leave this house with your permission, and on no terms but the ones we make, then may I court you?" The answer rose so quickly that Blanche almost gave it to him at once. That would have been honest. It would not have been quite right. She glanced at the folded guest list. All season she had decided where everyone else should stand. For once, she wanted the place of this answer to belong to her as completely as the answer itself. "Ask me again tomorrow morning," she said. Rupert's expression changed not to disappointment so much as careful attention. "Not because I am uncertain," Blanche added. "I have spent a season separating what I am paid to do from what I choose to give. I would like one question from you in a room where neither of us has business left to conduct." For a moment he said nothing. Then he bowed not as host to employee, but as one person accepting another's terms. "Tomorrow morning." The next morning Blanche dressed before the house had fully stirred. Her sealed reference lay in her reticule beside 2 notes requesting future work. Her wages were accounted for. Her trunk was strapped. Nothing practical required her to remain at Bramblewood another hour. She went to the small ballroom to retrieve a shawl left over the back of a chair. Morning light lay in pale bars across the polished floor. The room still held the faint chill of dawn and the sweet spent scent of last night's candle wax and fading flowers. The music stands had been removed. The flower arrangements were already coming down. On one chair rested the folded guest list from the night before. Rupert was near the center of the room trying to free a crooked place card someone had wedged into a decorative urn. He looked absurdly intent upon the task. Blanche stopped at the edge of the floor. There was no audience, no supper to save, and no plan that required either of them to move. "Your Grace," she said, "I need to determine something." He abandoned the place card. The familiar spark returned to his eyes. "That sounds dangerous." Blanche walked toward him and held out her hand. "I need to determine whether you actually know how to dance when there is no one present for you to charm." His smile came slowly. He took her hand and led her into the beginning of a country dance figure that had no music, and after 2 steps, no proper figure either. Blanche corrected his direction. Rupert accused her of inventing rules. She informed him that rules only troubled men who had failed to learn them. They made one turn across the empty floor. Then Rupert steadied, still holding her hand. "Miss Kelsey," he said, and the play in his voice softened without vanishing. "May I court you?" Blanche had thought the word yes would feel like surrendering a piece of ground. Instead, it felt remarkably like choosing where to stand. "Yes," she said, "but I am still taking the autumn commissions." Relief broke across his face in a laugh. "I should hope so. Bramblewood has survived 1 season under your rule. England deserves the same alarm, and you will not appear uninvited at every house that hires me." "Certainly not every house." She gave him a look. "I am learning disclosure," he amended. "I shall submit my intentions in advance." Blanche let him draw her back into the turn. Beyond the windows her carriage was being brought round. It no longer sounded like escape. It sounded like proof that she could leave, and that whatever came next would begin because she chose it. "You are stepping on my jurisdiction, Miss Kelsey," Rupert murmured when she corrected his footwork a second time. "You may file a complaint on the guest list tomorrow," Blanche said. He glanced toward the folded paper on the chair. "Tomorrow," Blanche smiled. "Very well. Next season." They continued across the empty ballroom with no music and no audience arguing softly about the steps. The guest list stayed folded on the chair, no longer deciding where either of them belonged. The end.